Hello again everyone, the Caro Kann that we're going through today might be one of the most fun lines to play. Now in the last couple episodes we talked about how black develops the bishop to f5, play pawn to e6, knight to e7, knight to d7, and then prepare to push the pawn to c5. Well, that is kind of out of the window in this episode. The move c5 as early as move 3 in this position. This move is in contrary to the principle of previous episodes, where we first develop our minor pieces and then looks to play c5. Early move pawn to c5 looks for rapid development of pieces and ease of development, as we can see later as the video goes on. Now white, just in any Caro Kann, of course, has many choices right here. Now you can play pawn takes on c5, pawn to c3, pawn to c4, just striking back the center of the board. He could also develop with knight to f3 right here. Knight to c3 is also a possibility instead of knight to f3. In this video, we're just going to see the most common reply, which is pawn takes on c5, and the general idea for both sides and what each side could go for. Here, black probably plays most of the time with pawn to e6, trying to regain the pawn back on c5, which is the most logical continuation. Queen to a5 to regain the pawn back with a check here seems a bit odd because of the pawn to c3. You can take the pawn on c5, but you're not really developing the piece on the king side, which is not really the core principle of this line. You want rapid development for your pieces, and so pawn to e6 seems the most logical. Now let us see some sensible move that white can actually opt for. He can go bishop to e3, but this is probably the least logical move to play, because then after knight to d7, you're probably attacking e5 and c5 at the same time. No way to defend that. You protect the pawn on e5, which is more valuable at the moment. You play bishop to c5, the bishop to c5, knight to c5. This position is actually okay for black. We're probably borderline to equal. We'll open up the c file for us. Probably going to place the knight on e4 someday. And so, for example, the useless move of pawn to b4, we just go knight to e4. And we're exerting dominance on the king side, because now queen to b6 is a possibility attacking f2 all of a sudden. Now I could play bishop to d3, getting rid of a knight here on e4, but he has to give up a bishop for that knight. I guess we're already slightly better in the opening. If he plays pawn to c4 again just for a sample move right here, we can just play knight to e7. Idea is we capture back on d5, should there be a capture on d5 later on. We also develop pieces trying to just castle very quickly and find safety. If he slowly develops a knight to d2, I guess we can just develop with knight to e7 as well. Again, we're just castling very quickly in the position. White has not even developed his kingside pieces and castled yet. And so I think we can safely say that black has equalized here and will find a very nice home for all his pieces. For example, bishop to e2 here, we can just castle, something like knight to c6 right here is very good for black, bringing all the pieces to the center of the board. If knight to b3, I think we can just play knight to e4 again, and or knight to d7. Suddenly we're just attacking this pawn right here on e5 twice. This should be a very nice continuation for black. And so probably we won't see bishop to e3 anyway, but what you will see quite a lot is pawn to a3, or instead of pawn to a3, first place knight to f3, and bishop to d3. Idea of the pawn to a3 is that after bishop takes on c5 with pawn to b4, attacking the bishop with tempo. Now we can develop the bishop to b2, but by delaying the development of knight to f3, white also has queen to g4 in this position. Again, this is a very classic idea because we move our bishop to c5, not protecting g7, so white just wants to bring strongest pieces to attack on g7, to see if they can force bishop to f8 or king to f8, compromising the castling right. Well, in this position we don't have to do both, but we're also not going to castle. We'll play knight to e7, sacrificing the pawn here on g7. Idea is after rook to g8, we have open g file right here that we can target. And anytime the bishop left the square here on f1, we can also take on g2, the same thing that he did to us. Moreover, the king is pretty much safe here on the king side. On the center of the board. The pawn here, f7, e6, and d5, which is a classical setup that black gets in all Caro Kann position. Probably discussed this in the first few videos as well. Then a queen here again can naughtily takes on h7, open up another file for us to attack. We're once again going to play knight to c6, developing our pieces. Idea is we really just want to see what he does. If he plays knight to f3, we just want to play queen to b6. Now attacking on f2 next move, there's no stopping it. Bishop e3 probably, but then bishop takes on e3, we got a check inside. We should be winning right here, despite being down a pawn. And we play something like pawn to b4. Obviously we see bishop to d4. Again attacking the bishop, the rook, and also the pawn here on e5. And also pawn to f4 doesn't help because let's say queen to b6, we're threatening the same thing. Anytime we can play, into this setup with bishop in front and queen behind to just give a check to steal away the castling right from your opponent, that should be very damn good. And just to show you how difficult it is for white to develop, let's say white plays knight to h3 in this position, protecting the square here in f2, also jumping to g5, attacking f7 or something. We can play bishop to d7. If he continues the plan, we castle. And either he takes the pawn on f7 with the knight or with the queen. We play rook to f8 and voila! Look at our new compatriots joining our battle here as we try to checkmate black very quickly. You know, sometimes taking pawns is good. I myself like to take pawns, but taking pawns like this and allowing your opponents to have a large counterplay like this, probably not something that we all want to go for. And so let's say in the position he understands the horrible situation is in. Let's say he plays knight to d2. We can play queen to a5 in this position. We develop our queen, place bishop to d7 next turn. He has difficulty to play pawn to b4, obviously because we take, and the rook will be hanging if he recaptures on b4. But let's just say he develop again with knight to f3. We just play queen to b6 back. We're threatening the same thing to attack on f2 in this position. There's no stopping it. And so we'll always have to make this kind of ugly move with knight to h3. You know, we can take on e5. That's a free pawn right there we can take. Even after bishop to e2 castle, we can play something like queen to c7. Perhaps castle on the queen side next turn. In general, the winning plan will be just trying to use the open h file and g file to your advantage right here and throw all your minor pieces to his king side. The move to play here for white is probably pawn to b4, and after bishop to b6, let's say for black, white could have played bishop to d3, we can play knight to c6, knight to f3, we can again place knight to e7, and just trying to develop pieces and then try to castle on the king's side very quickly. The knight could have been brought to g6 as well, attacking the e5 pawn twice. White in general brings the bishop to b2 in this position, but after knight to g6 and trying to cancel next move, this position is considered fine for black. Pawn to b5 can even play knight to e7, and all is fine. And queenside play we follow along pretty much easily, even if you understand only the general principle of chess. I also should note that in general position like this, black will want to play something like pawn to f6, getting rid of the pawn on e5, because the only thorn that black has in the position is the pawn here on e5, restricting so many positions. For example, the queen and the bishop would like to line up this way to actually deliver a checkmate, but can't do that because the pawn is here on e5. And so in a lot of positions, we just play pawn to f6 in this position, and if white captures the pawn on f6, we capture back with the g-pawn, and look at our open g-file again that we created for ourselves, without sacrificing any pawns by the way, and yeah, probably this should be good. Bishop attacking on f2, the rook coming here on g-file. I think this should be very good for black to play. Moreover, this position is just very solid and has no risk whatsoever in this position. No weak squares, no weak pawn. Okay, this pawn here on e6 protected by the bishop. The king can run to f7 to protect it, but should be very nice overall. The last move that white could have tried is knight to f3, completely ignoring the pawn here that is hanging on c5. And so in this position, I think we can just take the pawn on c5 immediately. So after bishop to d3, we can just, simply develop our pieces. In this position, it's also possible to play knight to b4, attacking the bishop on d3. Because as usual, in this position, there's always a great gift. And so knight d4, I think is just a good move as well. We can just take the bishop on d3, claims that we have an equal position, try to fight for advantage here with the bishop and the rook controlling the c file. Obviously in this position, you can play pawn to a3 as well, with the same idea of pawn to b4 and bishop to b2, as we talked about earlier. And in general, I think we can just develop with ease just as we saw in the last couple of minutes. And so this is the general main line that we can see in the early pawn to c5 break. Again, as usual, if I missed out any line, you can always comment down below in this video, or can always email me the same thing. But in any case also, I hope that I can provide some value to you on how to approach this position as black or white. The review video will be coming up next week. So until then, I hope you can actually grab some of the lines in this position and practice it against your opponent, against the computer, same thing, and try to grab some patterns before then. As usual, if you like this video, please leave a thumbs up.